I am Kristen Overstreet, a senior partner at Origin Editorial, which is a peer review management and editorial services company, and also at Origin Reports, which is a journal software application. Dr. Jason Roberts is also a senior partner at Origin Editorial and Origin Reports. He was the founding president of the International Society for Managing and Technical Editors, ISMTE, and in 2017, he published the book Peer Review, Reform and Renewal in Scientific Publishing. Additionally, he is an editorial board member of the journal Research Integrity and Peer Review, and he has worked with the Equator Network on elevating reporting standards. Dr. Roberts is considered an expert on editorial office reporting and has spoken at numerous industry conferences on this topic.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this second webinar from Origin Reports. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 data points, do not make a trend, and other inferences people make that are wrong. So one of the things that we notice working across many editorial offices at Origin Editorial is that we are asked to make some comparisons that we think aren't exactly valid, or there are panic questions that we have to field from an editor or a publisher. Well, why is this happening? And so what we're going to explore today is how you can't necessarily just take 2 data points and infer a trend. Okay, so the outline of today's webinar is that, well, first of all, we'll just role play a couple of scenarios. We'll then look at understanding trends and how you would actually interpret your data. And again, it's all going to be from an editorial office perspective. We will we'll look at making comparisons and how you go about doing that effectively. We'll just dwell on a couple of spurious comparisons that we see within editorial offices. And finally, just a few hints and tips on what you can do. All right, so the scenario part, first of all, of this webinar. So we've probably all been asked one of these questions in the past. So the yellow ones are probably the most obvious ones. So we might get asked, hey, I just noticed our submission are down over X period, say the first quarter, compared to the last quarter. Is this a problem? So that's just 2 data points, the last quarter, your current quarter. An editor might say, I noticed that our turnaround time to decision has dropped. That sounds like great news. So you have to dwell on those 2 data points once again. We have rejection rates as another common one. The rejection rate changes. We instituted this policy. What does this mean? It might mean nothing. This is it. This is the whole point with 2 data points. We just simply don't know enough to make an educated inference of the data. Okay, so let's actually just role play this so you understand exactly what we're talking about. So first of all, this is probably a common one that you may have faced. The scenario is this. At your journal, submissions through the end of the second quarter are down 21% over the same period during the previous year. So let's say Q1, Q2 of 2020 versus Q1, Q2 of 2021. Now the editor or the society or the publisher, whoever's in charge of this journal, they're worried and they've come to you saying, what's going on? They sound the alarm, but should they be concerned? So here's the data. So we're looking at Q2. In 2021, 190 submissions have been received. In 2020, the equivalent period, 240 submissions have been received. So this chart doesn't look great. There's been a big drop. But this is a very narrow focus. This is what we mean. This is your 2 data points. Does this really tell us the whole story? Well, let's broaden the picture. So just give you a moment to digest this data. What are we looking at here? So the gray parts of the bars are just the number of submissions through the end of the second quarter for everything from 2016 to 2021. So we've got 6 years worth of data there. Then what we included here in this chart is the actual final year totals. So for 2020, well, we know there was 240 submissions through the end of Q2. At the end of the year, it ended at 440 submissions. So what I'd like to draw your attention to, and this is why we now have all these extra data points, is that maybe we can detect a trend. And the trend is possibly this, that at 190 submissions through the end of Q2 in 2021, that's pretty much in line with where every year except 2020 has been. It's slightly higher than these other years, and this little table down here in the corner gives you the actual numbers. So you can see we're up about 10 over 2019 and up 20 over 2018. So perhaps what we're looking at is that 2020 was an outlier. Now, for many of you, this actually is probably very familiar because of a COVID boost in the number of submissions. I think there's very few journals that didn't see a dramatic increase. So, okay, so now we know that 2020 was an outlier. So just jumping on the fact that 2021 numbers are down over 2020 is actually that's an overreaction, and that would be a logical overreaction if all you had was 2 data points. But in fact, we have many more. We got all these previous years, so we know that that's an overreaction. Now, let's say COVID didn't happen. This is where you, as an editorial office professional, can draw upon your expertise, because possibly, let's pretend COVID didn't happen. Maybe in 2020, that was the year that the editor commissioned a huge special section of papers. So you got a lot of manuscripts that you solicited that you might not get in a typical year. So that maybe drove it. So, again, you've got this knowledge of what happened in that year. So make a note of that so that, when we look at these numbers 10 years from now, we will know, back in 2020, they did that massive campaign to solicit articles and it led to a big boost. It's important that you document this information either for yourself for a few years from now or for whoever succeeds you, so that they can interpret historical data accurately. Okay, so there's a lot to dwell on that slide, but maybe you all can all relate to this situation. Okay, so with 2 data points, you cannot determine if an outcome is a trend or chance. What do we mean by that? Well, trend is obviously that it's part of the bigger picture, something is going up or it's going down. But chance means that it just literally could mean that for whatever reason, during that time period that you're studying, things happen that way. So let's say the time that reviewers spend reviewing a paper suddenly drops by a mean of a day. It's like 14 days. Now it's 13 days. Maybe it just so happened for no coordinated reason that the reviewers just got faster over that particular quarter or whatever the time interval was. That's chance. And, if you go into complex statistics, you can account for that. But I know that most of us are English majors or certainly not statisticians. So, we're not expecting anyone in editorial offices to come up with complex math here. We just understand that you have to be able to basically explain something away. So how do you know if a 2 data point is not driven by outliers? Like in that example I just gave you, 2020 was an outlier. Well, the way to establish that is to look at more data. So, we can truly only compare ourselves, really. We most often can't see into other journals. So what we can do is look at our past performance. So that's how you would look for an outlier. And then, like I said, you need more data points to determine if a trend is linear or is it oscillating. Now that's important if you want to project forward. So I got 2 examples here. So the one on the left is a linear trend line here, which you could just do this in Excel. And so what we're seeing here is that over the years, the number of submissions has increased and at a fairly consistent rate. You can plot that trend line there and you can see obviously the direction that things are going in, and most years are trending upwards. 2016 was a bit of a drop, but overall things went up. But for some things, you might have an oscillating trend, which means that it's up one year, down the next, up one year, down the next. So what might be a better way of projecting forward is looking at the median. Like you take the median of all these values. So the median in this case was 280. And what you want to look at then is how many years were you above and how many years were you below? And then, you might start to make inferences based on a run of periods where you're above the median. So we can see here for the last 3 years, we've been above the median. So we can possibly suggest that things are going upwards, and that seems to be the norm. If you go back a bit further, 4 in the last 5 years have been above that median. So this is very easy to plot. You just simply calculate the median on that. You take each of those values and plot the median from that. Okay. So just to emphasize this point and why this is so critical, with the extra data point, you can confirm if a trend is real. So this is a real piece of data from a journal, and this was the lived experience that this is the time to first decision dramatically went backwards in this particular year, and the panic button was hit. My gosh, what is happening? Why is it taking so long to complete peer review? There were some issues, but equally, it just seemed to be down to chance. Now, this particular journal works in a field where things work very slowly. If you're thinking 120 days is a long time to the first decision. And so how do we know that this was chance? Well, we don't. At that moment in time in 2013, we didn't know what we were living with. But if I lift the curtain up, this is the trend, what happened. So clearly 2013 was an outlier. And so, it was useful to take the data point of 2012 to 2013 and realize something was going on. And so we needed to look at it, but we couldn't draw firm conclusions until more time had passed. And that's just simply a function of time. I'll return to this point in a minute of how 2 points can be useful, but they shouldn't be definitive. Here's another example. This chart was generated in Origin Reports. It's a nice simple bar chart that shows you the quarter-on-quarter submissions for a journal. And the trend was down each quarter through the fourth quarter of the year. You might be concerned about this. We now have 3 data points and this has gone down. So 3 data points might be something that at a minimum that you want to determine if this is a trend. So there is a trend here. It's gone down. Is it a long-term trend? Again, time will tell. Well, in the first quarter of 2021, it's back up again. Now, what we could also do then is look back to the numbers from Q1 2020, which are not included on this chart. And how does 107 submissions compare to Q1 in 2020? So this is how you build up a bigger and richer picture of what's happening at your journal. Okay, so more data points can increase your confidence in determining a pattern or trend. However, it is also important to note that too many data points may actually add nothing or distort the story. So, for example, when I took on one particular journal, they had at least 15 years worth of submission data in their charts, and they insisted on this. We were going back to like 2004. And so obviously, over 15 years, this journal has grown dramatically, like pretty much every journal out there. But what value was that information from 2004 at that point? The journal was completely different. The field was different. The funding was different. So the amount of research was different. There were no papers at that point from China. So the world was very different in 2004. Is there much value in reporting that far back at that point in time? So a question I've often got asked is, well, how many years of data should you report? And I mean, that is the absolute how long is a piece of string question. And I think you have to, be sensitive to your own journal context. But, typically, if I can't see an obvious reason why I need to go back further, I would keep it to 5 years or 5 years plus the current year that if you're halfway through 2021 and you're reporting, I'd maybe include 2016 data, for example. So what should you do if your editor or your publisher or your society owner of the journal comes along and says, why did submissions drop over the first 2 quarters of this year? And they're pointing a finger at you, or they're asking you to get this sorted. Something's going wrong. Well, before we hit the panic button, reframe the question and investigate this. How does the submission level this year compared to the equivalent period in previous years? And I don't just mean compare it to the last year, but compare it to the year before that and the year before that and maybe the year before that. Just get a richer picture of what happened. And do look at the same period of time, just in case, if your journal is one of those journals where maybe Q4, there's always a big drop off. So don't compare it to the previous quarter necessarily. But also, again, call upon your rich vein of expertise that you have and your experience. You understand more than just the data. The numbers just tell you something, but you need to be able to interpret it. So you also understand there may be external factors, such as in 2020, COVID hit, number of submissions went up. And you may also understand internal factors that other people haven't considered. So for instance, a policy change that maybe has changed the way that submissions go about. So for instance, you might say the journal is not actively seeking case reports anymore. Well, if that's the case, and a third of your submissions were case reports previous to that policy announcement, that's going to affect the number of submissions you have. Because, obviously some people are going to ignore or never bother reading your instructions for authors so that you'll still get case reports, but others will, and they'll say, okay, I'll send my case report elsewhere. So, you need to bring that in presenting your numbers. And Maybe you're in a situation where nobody's ever asked you for your opinion. Well, I suggest that you assert your right to express your opinion. It's one thing to just hand over the data and say, here you go. But if you're handing it over to people that aren't professionals like yourself, maybe they don't know how to interpret or contextualize your data. So I would strongly recommend that you always provide a commentary to go along with any results that you present, particularly if there is a trend that's appearing, or, if you can anticipate they see two data points and something's happening, that you can anticipate that they're going to ask that question. Okay, so here's the final word. So definitely don't say something is definitive or is a trend using two data points. However, don't dismiss them either, because you just be cautious of overinterpreting. Maybe the change between data points is a signal of something shifting and should be monitored. So keep track of this. So this is an actual real life example of the conversion rate of invitations into agreements to review. And like many journals, this journal had been for years, going back longer than the data presented here, had seen a decline in the number of people agreeing to review a manuscript, and it had dropped below 50% in recent years. There was a new editorial board at the start of 2021. And look at this number over here. Suddenly it leapt from 48% the previous year to 59.5% this year. So now, almost 3 in 5 invitations to review were being accepted. So we know, I've just given you the context, there's a new editorial board. So they may be doing something very different from the old editorial board. And there's a benefit to it. So, I'm making an inference on just 2 data points by looking at that, saying something's happened. What I'm actually looking at really is I'm going to keep monitoring this and see what happens in 2022. Because if this carries on, then we know that whatever the editorial board is doing is working. And so, this is just a signal in the data, and I'm going to keep tabs on it. Equally, this is just everyone's super excited there's a new editorial board, and so they're willing to help. Maybe by next year, it's going to drop back again down to 48 or 49%. Equally, if I look at the data over a longer trend, maybe this is just nothing in particular. It's just chance, because look at 2019. For some reason, it leapt up to 58% from all these other years where it was just, around about 50%. Suddenly it leapt up, then it went back down again. I've actually no explanation for what happened in 2019. I have no idea why that is the case. It could have just been that there was more really good papers that people wanted to read. Who knows? Perhaps it's just chance. Okay, so making comparisons. So we've gone over the scenarios. Let's just talk about making comparisons. We make comparisons to derive meaning from the numbers that we report. Most journals cannot compare themselves to others. So the best comparison is with past performance, okay? Okay, so what do I mean by these 2 points? Well, first of all, anyone can generate numbers. Numbers don't mean anything without context. You can provide that. And you've hopefully got some historical background to understand what your journal's doing. If you happen to be able to see data for another journal for whatever it is that you're measuring, just understand that could be a completely different author base. Maybe the editors behave in a different way. It's almost impossible to look at another journal and measure yourself against that, unless your journals are almost identical in many different ways. So you're going to make a comparison. First, ask yourself, why am I making this comparison? What do you intend to do with the results? And are you going to react to that? Too often people just generate data and then start asking these questions. You really need to have already decided, what am I going to get out of this data before you even figure out what the data is, and then actually go ahead and generate the results. Because you could totally bias your data by just simply asking the wrong question. Or by asking a question of the data and then drawing up a whole secondary conclusion afterwards. Well, I wasn't looking for this, but I've spotted this, so I'm going to go off in this direction and explore this. But again, just ask yourself, what am I going to do with this data? And how quickly am I going to react? So again, if you saw a dramatic drop in submissions or turnaround time, are you going to react to that right away? Or are you just going to monitor it and see what happens? Okay, so then determine whether the data tells the whole story or merely signposts what to investigate further. So that's what I'm saying. Look back, maybe plan to look forward and see what the actual true story is. The nature of the question you ask shapes the comparison. So some comparisons are multidimensional. And so it's not just data set A and data set B, and let's smush them together and see what we see. Sometimes you can do more than that. This chart, which I've just zoomed in on, is one of the favorite charts that people have in Origin reports. We call it the editor bubble chart. But what we're looking at here are three metrics in this chart. Along the x-axis are the days it takes from the moment manuscript is assigned to the moment that the editors, in this particular case, post a recommendation. So it's gone through, they get assigned the paper, they pick the reviewers get their comments back, they make a recommendation. That's what this is a mean of that along the x-axis. Along the y-axis is the rejection rate. So, this person up here is rejecting somewhere between 70 and 80% of the papers that they receive. The size of the bubble reflects the number of papers that they're looking at. Now, because I've zoomed in here, you can't actually tell, how many papers are included in this red bubble here. If you were using Origin reports, there'd be a table off on the right that gives you the actual numbers. Plus, if you hovered over this, you could see who that person is and how many papers they've handled and what the precise numbers are for both of these things. Is it 18? Is it 55? Is it whatever it is? So the beauty of a multi-dimensional chart like this is now we can make several comparisons here. So we can compare how fast. We know that these editors over here are slow compared to these editors over here. We know that this editor up here is particularly tough. This editor down here seems to let most papers through. We know that this particular editor looks at a lot of papers. We know that this person over here doesn't really look at very much. So we're making comparisons now. But these are just the numbers. Now, what you need to do is apply, information that you know. Is this person over here really quick? Simply because we know that they immediately reject a lot of papers. So that makes them fast, okay? This person over here might be really slow because they're in an area of the field where maybe they need the help of extra statisticians, and statisticians might take longer to review a paper than the clinical expert, if it's a medical journal, for example. Maybe this person handles, I know from some of the work that Origin does that, mathematical physics could take up to a year to review a paper. It takes a long time, whereas other areas of physics go really quickly. So if it's a journal that has both of those areas of physics contained within it, it's unfortunate, but you can't really compare the editor that's in charge of the mathematical physics papers compared to the other editors that might be down this end of the spectrum. So use your experience and inside knowledge to interpret the data correctly, but be alert to confounders, such as I just gave the example of the subject matter, maybe article types. Perhaps you have an editor that's in charge of review articles. Well, if they're reviewing, huge meta-analyses, that might take a lot of extra effort compared to someone who's in charge of just reviewing case reports, 1,000-word case reports. Be alert to changes in policy, particularly if you compare over time, where you can say, well, we're much quicker than those people were back in 2018. Well, maybe they had a different way of doing things because that was the policy at the time. Changing leadership might affect that too. But also look at the time. You have to factor these things in. Somebody, typically what we find is that people start off slow because they're tentative and learning the ropes, then they get faster. And then after time, maybe some people get complacent and they know that, I can make that recommendation next week. Nobody's really going to chase me down to get that recommendation in. So they start to slow down again. Maybe they get burned out. So you need to look at extra factors. So I've given you with that bubble chart, great way, to say, okay, this is the picture. The next step would be to delve deeper into that. Why does the data show what it does? Then there are time confounders. So what is the time interval being compared? Is it the previous quarter, the equivalent quarter in the previous year? As I hinted at before, just, comparing Q4 and then Q1 of the next year might not be the valid comparison. Maybe you need to compare Q1 of the previous year. Is the time interval actually meaningful? So does month-on-month comparisons, what does that actually bring to the table? You can see here, we've got a classic example of oscillating data. This is month-on-month number of submissions, okay? And you can see that there is absolutely no pattern here. Some months it's high and then next month it's low. But does the month actually affect anything? Maybe it does. You might assume perhaps December is slower because of the holiday season. But really, is there a reason why May is faster than June or slower than June? Who knows? What you can do is maybe look at is again look at, well, let's have a look at December 2020 and compare it to December 2019. They seem to be about the same. But you look at March in 2019, it's really low. March in 2020 is really high. What does this tell us? Nothing, maybe. Maybe it just so happens that, just that particular March, it's just higher. Maybe next year it was lower again. So what am I trying to say here is that maybe a month-on-month comparison is actually not that useful, because unless the month absolutely dictates author behavior, it doesn't really tell us anything. There's no predictable pattern here. Okay. The timing of making a comparison can shape outcomes. Okay. So this is one point that I dwell on particularly, as I see this done so often, and I cannot agree with this approach, is that people measure rejection rates, annual rejection rates, based on the date of submission. So what do I mean by this? It's the end of the first quarter, and your editor says, can you tell me what our rejection rates on 2021 submissions are at the end of Q1 2021? So this is not what is our rejection rate on all decisions made in the first quarter of 2021. It's the rejection rate of the decisions made on papers submitted in 2021. There's a big difference there. And why does this affect? So this is what I mean about the timing confounder, because what is the significance of that? Well, think about this, is that if you're just monitoring the decision ratios, you'll have papers from 2020 in that mix, because all the papers that you're looking at in the first few weeks of January are probably 2020 submissions. They're the previous year's submissions, okay? So, that's going to mean that you've got a fairly normal pattern going on there. It's like just what would happen at any other time in the year. But if you say, no, I only want to look at papers that came in 2021, well, your rejection rate is going to be much higher initially, because if your journal does immediate rejections, that's going to dominate, because any paper that gets immediately rejected has a final decision. Any paper that goes out to full peer review might be out in full peer review for several weeks, so no decision has been made. So if you look at, I'm only going to look at papers that have a decision, well, guess what? It's going to have all those immediate rejections in there. And this is illustrated here. I'm going to show you, literally show you an example in a moment. But in this particular case, if you just reported at the end of January, what's our rejection rate on 2021 submissions, it was 89%. By February, if you say, what's our rejection rate in 2021 so far on 2021 submissions, it's down to 74%. By December of that year, it's down to 69%, which is actually typically, if you look back historically at the journal, is where it would sit. And I thought this was a neat graphic, a neat little video rather, that just sums up the situation. So what's happening here is you can see that number just drops and then it comes back up, stabilizes to where it was. But that circle at the top there was where it was in January. So you can see it just shifts down, down, down. Then it comes back up a little bit at the end of the year, but that could just be because, they decided to reject a bit more, could just be chance. But you can see it just dropped off very quickly from the start. Other time confounders, historical comparisons. Do you know precisely what was measured 10 years ago? Was it documented? One of the things that Origin reports, every single chart that you generate will have a set of parameters, and you can choose to keep that on the chart, as I did in this example here, or otherwise. But the reason why I do this is because I want to know, what did I count in this? Maybe when I said, what are the number of submissions, my editor said, but please exclude letters to the editor and guest editorials, because that's not really reflective of what I actually want to know is how many original articles, either case reports, review articles, or original research came in. Don't care about letters, don't care about the editorials. Now, I've documented this, so I will know the next time I run this report, oh, that's right, that's what I was counting. Equally, if I left, somebody would come along and go, okay, that's what they're counting. If I hadn't documented this, maybe they would include the letters to the editor and the guest editorial. And then they're suddenly thinking, well, I don't understand why this was so low before, because we're so high now. So it's really important that you do document your parameters. And so we actually use that in Origin reports as a default thing. You can choose not to display it on your charts, but it's always going to be there when you run a chart, because it is that important. And so often I see editorial offices do not note what they did. Okay. Another point about making comparisons, this is really important, is we all do pre and post analysis. So what do I mean by that? We might not know that's what it's called, but that's what we're doing, is that we make a change, we stage an intervention. We're going to cut the time that reviewers have to peer review a paper from 21 to 14 days. And then logically, we measure, did that make a difference? What did that policy succeed? But then we run into the issue of, but what are you measuring? Or rather, what is the time interval that you're measuring? Because comparisons around an intervention can be challenging. Should you just measure immediately before and immediately afterwards? That seems logical, but there are problems with that. Should you actually measure the equivalent time period in previous years? And I'll show you in a chart what I mean by that in a second. And how many data points at an absolute minimum should you collect to have something meaningful? So here are 3 ways of looking at this. So the most common thing that I often see people do is they make a change. January 1, we're going to say reviewers now have 14 days instead of 21 days to peer review a paper. And we're going to look at what that does to overall turnaround time for articles submitted. And so the logical thing is, here's the intervention staged here. Let's look at what was happening in Q4 2020, then look at what's happening in Q1 2021. Okay, that tells us something happened. But again, we've only got 2 data points. Can we draw a trend from that? I don't know. Could just be chance why it's quicker. Maybe what we do is we look at the first quarter of the 2 previous years at an absolute minimum, if we assume that 3 data points is the absolute minimum. So yeah, sure, we're actually quicker than we were in Q1 2020. So if all we'd done was make that comparison, as opposed to Q4, we just did Q1 in 2020 versus Q1 2021, we say, we're faster. But if you then factor in 2019, well, actually, we're a day slower. So what does this mean? Maybe this was the outlier year. And in fact, so we staged this intervention here, but it actually hasn't made any difference if you want to look at 2019. Another way of looking at this is maybe we look at the 3 previous quarters prior to the intervention. Here's the intervention, the start of the year. And we look at and then we have to just be patient and look at the next 3 quarters through after the intervention. So we're looking at now just over 15 months worth of data. Well, we can see that there was a general trend down anyway. And then we just sort of fed into that. Here with the intervention, it dropped, went up a day, or 2, maybe that's not significant. Who knows? But what I'm saying is that now we've got a broader picture. So this doesn't really give us much of a picture, but so often I see this happen. We just take 1 data point before and then 1 data point afterwards, and then draw all manner of inferences from it. So the reality is you need more data points at an absolute minimum. Neither of these is, either of these rather, I should say, could work. One is not better than the other. They're just different ways of looking at the data. Ideally, you could maybe do both. Okay, spurious comparisons. We're almost at the end here, but are you making a comparison that is valid? Does the data capture a behavior that was performed under the same conditions? And if conditions were different, can you really make the comparison? So what I'm trying to say here is, let's say there's a complete change of the editorial board and change of the office protocols. So literally you changed out who was working on these papers. You also changed how you're going to manage things. You've got a much tighter protocol. We're going to intervene much quicker. We're not going to give reviewers 21 days. We're going to give them 14. Oh, and we've really trained up this new team of editors, and they understand that they have to post a recommendation in X or Y days. The old group didn't seem to know what they were doing. So really, can you make a fair comparison? Only you can judge that. But I mean, if you do the comparison, you have to put that health warning on your data, I think. So another example of that, of sometimes where the data just simply is something that you shouldn't compare, it makes no sense, is comparing reviewers by their recommendation ratios, i.e. who rejected the most. So you take a list of all your reviewers and say, well, look at this person up here. They looked at 10 papers and they rejected 90% of them. They're a real tough reviewer, and this other person over here at 10 papers, and they only rejected 10% of those papers. But ultimately, unless every reviewer evaluated the same manuscript, the comparison is interesting and it tells you something, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. Maybe the person with 90% was given just awful papers. Maybe they were given case reports at a journal that says we don't really want to publish case reports anymore if we can help it. So no wonder that they're at 90%. The other person might be reviewing the very best papers because they're the very best person in the field. And they said, look, can you just be, looking at these great papers? We won't trouble you with the mediocre papers or the papers that we're sitting on the fence on. Another example might be comparing rejection rates following an editor succession. It's important to know this. How are we doing against the old editor? But doesn't mean to say that it's definitive information, because we don't know what was going through the head of the old editor necessarily. Maybe they were marching to a different beat. Maybe the publisher back then was saying, you've only got a limited number of pages, so do not publish this huge volume of material. Are you using two data series that can be compared? Can one affect the other? That's important to remember. If not, not even a million data points will tell you that there's a trend. Okay, I mean, you can just keep putting in all these data points that you want, but it's not going to tell you anything. It's just more noise. For instance, comparing editors by the mean number of reviewers that they select per paper. Meanwhile, ranking performance based on how fast they are. So you could have an editor that's, it seems to take a long time, and they are inviting 10 people to review a manuscript. So you could say, well, the reason why they're taking such a long time is because they're not picking the right reviewers. And so they're constantly having to go back into the system and invite more people just to secure the mandatory minimum number of reviewers. That's a perfectly legitimate inference. However, you could also have an editor that is really fast and still picking 10 reviewers per paper. Why are they really fast? Well, because they just do a scattershot approach, just fire off 10 people right away. And so instead of rationing the number of invitations that go out, they send out 10 invitations, and then obviously a lot of people accept right away. And that's not necessarily good either, because you're burning out your reviewers by over inviting them. So you can't really make a conclusion on timeliness based on the number of reviewers that they invite. Okay. So finally, tips on what to do with your data. Be wary of reacting to two data point trends. Okay, so I've given you plenty of examples. It's, you can certainly be alert to something, but don't make a policy change or reverse a policy change just because you see something happening from one data point to another. Instead, use the result to formulate more considered questions using a series of previous data points. Okay, I've spotted this. I'm going to keep an eye on it. Maybe I'll also put this trend in context and go and look back further and see if it really is a trend or if it's nothing. Okay, so that's the second thing you should do. Consider the appropriateness of the time interval that you're measuring. And that is, again, it's like if you're measuring month on month, is that really a useful comparison? How far back do you want to go before it actually becomes less useful or becomes more useful? Always provide the results with your interpretation of what you understand what's going on. So don't just, if your editor says, get me the turnaround times for reviewers this year, don't just hand that over. Hand it over with your interpretation of what you see. Be prepared to answer additional, deeper, or more specific questions once you make an initial comparison. So, okay, you've found something in the data, and don't just sit there and accept that as it's happening. Why is it happening? Ask more questions of your data. Do a secondary analysis based on what you found. What does this mean? Is it significant of anything? Is it just nothing? And then proactively counter two data point assertions. If you're being asked, to look into this, why is this a problem? This just seems to be happening. If they're unfair or overly aggressive, give it time. Come in with your own deeper dive. Provide more data points to look into what's going on, and maybe that might settle any nerves that your editors perhaps have, or your publisher might have. Okay, so there was a lot to digest there, and hopefully you learned something here today, and maybe how to push the data that you can generate that little bit harder. Thank you for your time.
So Sherry Hill, who you just heard from, is our reports project manager, and she and I will address any questions that you might have at this point. I see we have a few that have come in already. The first one is, here it is. When putting together an editorial board report, should all of the charts have the same time range? Sherry, do you want to address that one?
Sure. Not necessarily. It depends very much on what type of chart you are creating. If you're creating submissions by year, it's easier to cover a range of 4 to 6 years, as Jason mentioned. However, if you happen to be showing the information in quarters, your chart would become very busy and kind of overly cluttered if you tried to do that many years with all of the quarters bars. Another thing you have to determine is what you're trying to show. The submissions by country is an excellent example. If you were trying to show 5 years of that data, hoping that you have submissions from a large number of countries, that would also be very cluttered. So usually if we're doing something like submissions by country, we're looking to show maybe 1 to 2 years of data on that chart. Submission by manuscript types, you can get a little bit wider date range on that, maybe 2 to 3 years, depending on the number of manuscript types your journal has. So you have to kind of look at each chart individually and make realistic judgments. You want to show a broad enough range so that you can actually see any real trends, not try to add so many data points that it makes the entire thing very difficult to read. Christy?
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. Where do you record the information that might affect your reporting? That's a question that I was thinking about as well. I'm as Jason was talking, I was thinking, wow, I need to have like a file folder on my desktop where I keep track of questions I might have, or things that happen during the year to the journal that I might want to talk about when I do the annual editorial board report. For example, if we did a call for papers in March and then saw an increase in submissions in April and May, you know, I would want to mention and remind everyone, including myself, that we did a call for papers in March. By November, December, I may not remember that. You know, other things like new editors came on in January. Did we see an effect in our turnaround times or the types of papers we were accepting, things like that? That's something else I'd want to record. So I think just, you know, finding a place that works for you to keep track of that information, and just, you know, trying to remember to do it, making it a habit, that will help you down the road with your reporting. Another question we have is, I agree with Dr. Roberts that we should not look at rejection rates by year submitted, but my editor absolutely insists upon it. What should I do? I totally get that. I have had editors that have done the same. They really want to see rejection rate based on the submissions of that year. I think you can explain, if you're able to, depending on the relationship with the editor, why you prefer to report based on the decisions made in the year instead of the paper submitted in the year, or whatever the term is that you're looking at. But likely you may have to report that way, and that you reporting the way the editor wants to see it, that there are, you know, what the decisions were on the paper submitted in the time frame he wants to see. But then I think Jason, you know, showed us a number of ways of, you know, how to explain what's happening. Why are we seeing this, you know, large number of rejections in January? Kind of thing. So explain, you know, providing that commentary with the data that you're providing the editor would be helpful.
Another thing that you absolutely want to do on your chart is to record somewhere what date you're basing the time frame on, so that if you have been reporting, say, your rejection rate by submission date, and you convince them that it's more stable to report it by the year that the decision is made, make sure you're recording it somewhere, because this would be the kind of confounder that if you looked back at historical charts, which we don't encourage you to do, it would be very easy to think that there had been a dramatic change when really all that had changed was the date that you were using to report your data out. So in origin reports, we have that in the parameters section. It makes it really easy. But regardless, somewhere on your chart, you should absolutely make a note of that.
Good point. The last question I see is, can you compare 3 data points in a single chart? Sherry, do you want to take that one?
You know, as Jason went through, you can, but it is can be kind of risky. It's better to at least look at a broader range so that you have a better feel for what's going on. Jason had numerous examples of how you can get into trouble by having too narrow of a focus. 2 data points is absolutely risky, but even 3 can be can give a very false impression. So within reason, adding more data usually provides a much clearer view of what's going on. And as Jason also pointed out, there are times that we get kind of excited. We make a big change at our journal, a policy change. We implement something. I worked on a journal. We implemented a methodology review, and right away we wanted to see if we were having, you know, what results we were getting from that, if our rejection rate was going up. And the truth is that the initial data points didn't make it clear that really anything had changed. Over time, we could see it. The methodology review being very slow, the results didn't come out until a little bit later. So even if you're looking for a change and you only have a data point or 2 past that event, just be prepared to be patient. You can report out on it, but make it very clear to everyone who is receiving the report that it's a preliminary and that more time needs to pass before you can make a true evaluation. Christy?
Now, you interpreted that question differently than I did, and you may have gotten what they really were, the person was thinking of. But I wondered if they were talking about, how do you include data on, for example, the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis? Is that something we're doing in that bubble chart?
Okay, so you're talking, maybe they were talking about 3 variable chart. Yeah, so if you want to get a deeper look into your data, you can definitely add a 3rd variable, where the variable 1 is usually what we consider to be on the y-axis, variable 2 being on the x-axis, and variable 3 usually gives us the legend information that allows us to provide segments on a chart, such as submissions. You could also do on that same chart, you could add the 3rd variable of manuscript type, for instance. So you could see what types of manuscripts you were receiving in a given year. If you were, so you could also do it by country. You can do that on all of your, you know, the different charts. On the editor chart that we looked at specifically, the additional information, that is actually pretty unique. It's a 4 variable chart because it tells us not only how fast they are, the assignments that they got. So that chart in particular has a lot of information, and when you include the table next to it, there's even additional information that comes in on that chart.
And that chart definitely needs commentary to go with it. You know, I think a lot of people that look at that aren't going to immediately understand the data that you're showing to them, but it is a really useful chart if you explain to them what they're seeing. It does provide a lot of information in a glance. So that's, I believe, the end of our questions for today, and that wraps up our webinar. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar in a series sponsored by Origin Reports. And please stay tuned to our social channels. You can follow us at Origin Reports to hear more announcements about future webinars and learning opportunities. Thank you all for attending today.